Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 273, Bully Hayes, Part 4. The Pioneer arrived in Apia commanded by the well-known American Ben Pease. This man introduced the first blackbirds into Fiji. On the 1st of April 1870, the Pioneer sailed from Apia with Hayes on board. On the 3rd of October 1870, Constable Williams reported to Earl Granville that the Pioneer was heavily armed with guns and breech-loaded rifles and carried a large crew. That after leaving Apia, she proceeded to Savage Island by means of forged orders obtained with £300 worth of produce owned by J&T Skinner of Sydney. The consul says that he is informed that Peace lands an armed army on any island, takes off to his vessel any coconut oil he can find, and in this manner he's prowling the seas and carrying on his piracies. Hayes and Pease proceeded on a trading cruise in the Caroline Islands and the Marshall Islands in the Pioneer. They argued over the ownership of the cargo. Hayes claimed the cargo was his and Pease was merely carrying its freight, while Pease claimed a half share of the cargo. Hayes sold the cargo in Shanghai. A few months after he rescued Hayes from Apia, Pease disappeared. There were a number of theories relating to his disappearance. One was that he was killed in a fight on the Bonin Islands. The British Commander-in-Chief on a China station reported that Ben Pease had been captured by the Spaniards and taken to Manila. And another source said that Pease was captured in the Palau Islands and jumped overboard from the Spanish warship Hernandez Pizarro and was drowned. Another account said that Pease was sent to America for trial. What was known was the Pioneer arrived back in Apia with Hayes in sole command. The boat had become dilapidated and Hayes bought her from the firm's assignees for a small sum in cash and the cancellation of a claim for wages due to himself and the crew. The explanation Hayes gave for being in charge was that Ben Pease had sold the ship to Hayes and retired to China. That explanation was doubted by many, but certainly was not challenged. Hayes renamed the ship Leonora after his favourite daughter, painted her white in an effort to change her reputation, and flew the American flag, although it was doubtful he was legally entitled to do so. He continued to trade in coconut oil, copra and blackbirding. On the 19th of November 1870, the Fiji Times said that the HMS Rosario arrived at the Gilbert Group a week earlier, and Captain Chellis made the acquaintance of Captain Hayes, who left having heard that the captain of the American warship Jamestown wanted an introduction to him. A son, Frederick William Henry Hayes, was born in Lawrence, New Zealand on the 25th of November 1870. On the 29th of March 1871, when the records of the Bangkok United States Consulate showed that the brig Leonora sailed from Saigon and Indochina bound for Hong Kong, with W. Hayes owner and master, but was put into the port of Bangkok in distress. The Sydney Morning Herald said, "The notorious Captain Hayes. We learn that Captain Hayes, who was said to have been killed, is still alive and active. He's now in command of the brig Leonora. This is an armed American vessel, and for 2 or 3 years was reported at visiting various islands in the South Seas under doubtful circumstances. On a visit to China, serious charges were made against Captain Pease, who commanded her. He was sent to the US for trial." The Leonora arrived at Bangkok Leaky. She was discharged and docked, having a cargo of rice from Saigon to Hong Kong. The Leonora grounded soon after leaving Cape St. James and made 4 inches of water an hour. On the 27th of April 1871, Hayes again put to sea light, having had the Leonora repaired, caulked and coppered, and left his cargo of rice as payment for the work, as well as other expenses incurred in Bangkok. It's reported that Hayes chartered a small schooner from Mohammedan at a monthly rate to go to the Philippines and thence to the South Sea Islands, where Hayes would fall in with her and where it is reported the Muslim would forever lose all vestige of his craft. On the 10th of February 1872, the Americans had taken possession of Tutuila, a small rocky island on the Navigator Group. Captain Meade of the US warship Narragansett left in haste for Apia, as Meade heard that Hayes had arrived in an armed vessel.
Meade had orders to arrest Hayes for reported oppressive conduct towards the Caroline Islanders. He took Hayes prisoner. After examining Hayes's papers and crew for 3 days, Captain Meade could find no evidence sufficient to warrant him sending Hayes to San Francisco for trial, and he let him go with a warning. Meade could not find witnesses or sufficient proof. Hayes's reputation meant that no crew members would give evidence against him. On his acquittal, Hayes returned to the Leonora and dressed her out with flags in honour of his escape. Reverend Powell, who assisted in the arrest of Hayes by Manga, the chief of Pago Pago in 1869, wrote on the 21st of February 1872 from Samoa to Reverend Sunderland of Sydney, agent for the London Missionary Society, "How is it that, with such a mass of evidence as was collected on his detention here on the kidnapping of the people of Manahiki, that he is allowed to go at large?" Another 2 children were born, a boy and a girl, on the 3rd of November 1873 at Apia, but they were stillborn. In September 1874, the British warship Rosario arrived at Strong's Island, known as Ualan and Kusai, and discovered Hayes, part of his harem, and the crew of the Leonora brig had been wrecked on the island on the 15th of March in only 9 metres of water. A cyclone had struck and the vessel sunk from under him. When the cyclone passed, Hayes and his crew were said to have hauled 4 vast chests of treasure from earlier raids in the South Pacific into the Cosray jungle and buried them. According to rumour, Japanese troops in World War II found one of the chests, but the other 3, with their now millions of dollars in loot, are supposedly laying somewhere out there in Cosray's steamy rainforests. They had been on the island for more than 6 months. William Hayes wrote a letter from Strong's Island on the 26th of September 1874. This was addressed to 5 men of cargo companies. "I am sorry to inform you of the loss of my vessel on this island on the 15th of March, and I have never seen a sail since that time till now. Mellon is coming with a small schooner, and since his arrival I've been arrested by an English ship of war, and they're going to take me to Sydney on account of the things I took from Tarawa with Jim Porter. I don't know what they will do yet. I don't think that they can do anything with me for it. If not, I will soon be with you again. I have given Mr. Beck my power of attorney to settle with him. Then you must do the best you can till you hear from me again. I remained W.H. Hayes." So he appointed Beck as his attorney on the 19th of August 1874, and he was obviously arranging to get away from Strong's Island and leaving Beck in charge. The captain of the British warship Rosario said that Hayes left Strong's Island on the 27th of September 1874 in a boat, taking 1 man with him. On the 10th of October 1874, from the Rosario, a letter was written from A.E. Dupas, commander, to Commander Goodenough of the ship Pearl. "Sir, with reference to Mr. Hayes, master of the American brig Leonora, I beg to forward the following statement of facts relative to him that I've been able to collect among the different islands visited during the present cruise of the ship under my command. There can be no doubt that Mr. Hayes is a most unprincipled but shrewd man, one who has, I have no doubt, committed many shocking acts of violence on the natives, and to say the least of them been guilty of many of a dishonesty towards other persons, yet so clever is he in the methods of proceeding, and so much has his name got to be feared by both natives and white residents on the islands, that though it was evident that nearly all of the islands I visited he was well known, yet it was impossible to find out much about him or his deeds. I was perfectly convinced that nearly the whole of the whites and natives were afraid to speak out. At Providence Island I heard direct evidence against him in a case of shockingly brutal treatment of a young girl whom he brought from the island of Pinjalap. On entering Scarborough Harbour on Strong's Island, Mr. Hayes came out to meet the ship in a boat. He told me that his vessel had been wrecked in South Harbour of the island on the 1st of March, and that he'd been living on shore and collecting oil. I commenced making inquiries as quickly and as quietly as I could about Hayes, but here, as at other places, I met with the same disinclination from all parties to tell anything they might know. Mr. Milne hinted that Hayes had robbed him not long since, would at first say nothing, nor was it till after considerable persuasion and the delay of some days that I got a statement from him. I also accidentally heard of another case of rape and shocking cruelty on the person of a young native girl, and satisfied myself of its correctness. The chief, or king of this place, through Mr. Snow, told me he should like me to remove Hayes from his island as he was afraid of him. Hayes, alarmed by hearing from some of his crew of the inquiries that had been made, left the island in a boat on the night of the 27th, taking one man with him. His design was, I believe, either to make the island of Buabi, Ascension Island, or Pinjalap. At their own request, and also considering it to be a good thing to rid the island of them, I took 5 of the crew of the Leonora on board for passage to Sydney, and one other, Louis Beck, who had been a passenger on board, and from what I could hear, a great friend of Hayes. The chief particularly urged his removal as a man likely to stir up trouble on the island. I visited Mr. Hayes's residence at South Harbour. He'd collected a large quantity of oil. No less than 5 young women or girls were living in his house, who had all, with one exception, been living on board the Leonora with him. It is with regret that I'm obliged to report my failure to collect sufficient evidence against him to warrant my doing so. The cases of cruelty to the native girls could have been proved, I think, but I consider it would have been exceeding my instructions to apprehend an American subject on such charges, and doubtful whether the Sydney law would have been able to deal with such cases. Just a warning at this point, there is going to be some detailed discussion about sexual assault, so if you'd like to forward around about a minute or two, if you would prefer to avoid that information. Then he also added that he interviewed Henry Gardner, an American by birth, who stated that in 1871 I engaged Mr. Hayes as a master of the brig Leonora to go to Providence Island and collect oil and other produce the island afforded for him. About July 1872, while still living on shore, Hayes came there in his vessel. He had a young Pinjalap girl on board with him, and one day he brought her on shore and took her into the bush. About half an hour afterwards I saw the girl coming out of the bush. And then there's a note saying what follows is unfit for publication. I afterwards inquired from the women, and they told me he had intimacy with her using great violence. The girl was 10 years old. Emma, an Ocean Island girl, came to Strong Island in a whale ship 6 months ago. Mr. Hayes, on coming to this island, took her to his house and assaulted her. He used most brutal violence, and the girl bled very much. This was 2 or 3 months ago. The girl has not recovered yet and can hardly walk. The surgeon's opinion is that she cannot be no more than 8 or 9 years old. A Pinjalap called Beloza actually saw the assault committed and described it as brutal in the extreme. And this statement was made in the presence of Commander Dupuis, plus L. Whitney, the staff surgeon, Lewis Jones, the lieutenant, and E. Milne, the master of the schooner Mentantu. Then William Hicks, a half-caste Fiji man who was second mate and spent 3 years on the Leonora, and Arso, a Chinaman who was on board the Leonora for 4 years as a cook, both made similar statements. About March we went to Pinjalap Island and Hayes went on shore. He came on board bringing 2 chiefs. After dining, he sent one on shore to tell the natives to bring 7,000 coconuts on board and 2 girls. The other chief he kept in the cabin and told me not to let him go on deck. The natives brought between 5,000 and 6,000 coconuts and 1 girl, and Hayes let the chief go. About 2.5 years ago, he got a young girl from Pinjalap, took her on shore at Providence Island, and violently assaulted her and ravished her. The girl cried out and was much hurt. She was taken on board the ship, where she was for 2.5 months, then taken back to Pinjalap. The girl was very young, quite a child. I have known him treat other young girls the same. And then the King of Strong's Island, Tugusa, on the 30th of September 1874, made a statement to Captain Dupuis. My kind friend, I am glad to see your ship to my island at this time. I think because you come, Captain Hayes he go. I am very glad for this. We think Captain Hayes one bad man. I like very much you take him on board your ship and carry him off. Another thing make me glad, because you take away Mr. Beck. That man speak no true. I thank you plenty, because you helped me make my island good. So after escaping from Strong's Island, Hayes fell in with an American whaling ship. On the 22nd of June 1875, it says, Captain Hayes, an American citizen and master of the Leonora, shipwrecked on one of the Caroline Islands, arrived at Guam on the 28th of February 1875 with Mr. Whitney, a whaling master, on board the American bark the Arctic for the purpose of purchasing a small schooner, which, so he says, was formerly consigned to him. After buying the schooner, Captain Hayes, on the 8th of April 1875, requested inspection and clearance, which was duly done. 2 days later, Hayes anchored at Fascinen Cove on the northern peninsula. The Spanish governor ordered the commanding officer, Don Jose Perez Rivera, and 20 men, after having posted themselves all night near the cove, to capture the captain when he came ashore to bathe and take him prisoner. The captain was brought to this capital and placed in jail, convicted of aiding the escape of political prisoners. And in the Sydney Morning Herald in December 1875, Bully Hayes arrested by the Spaniards and taken to Manila. We've received further information respecting this celebrated character from a trader who's just arrived in Sydney by the German schooner Corin, which arrived on the 22nd of November from the South Sea Islands. This person informs us that he was at Guam towards the latter end of April in 1875, and Captain Hayes was there with the fore and aft schooner Arabia. There are a number of Spanish prisoners at Guam, and Captain Hayes made a bargain with several of these convicts to take them away in the Arabia in consideration of $24 apiece. They gave him the money and went on board the vessel, but the Spanish authorities, having obtained some inkling of the affair, arrested Captain Hayes on the beach and placed him in safe custody in Manila Jail. Captain Joshua Slocum of the yacht Spray, who sailed around the world, continued with information on Hayes's history. It says, "When I called upon Hayes in the Manila jail, I found him in the midst of the governor's family on the veranda discussing religious matters. He was reading devoutly from a copy of the Bible. He became a chum of the governor of the prison, and he struck up a warm friendship with the priest, who baptised him in the Roman Catholic faith while he was locked up. Now that he was converted to the true faith, Hayes found an all-powerful friend in the Bishop of Manila. The buccaneer was penitent, and he made a most impressive and moving figure. Fever had twisted and shrunken him until I recognised him only by his long beard and his unusual height and breadth. The light, free spring of his gait was gone, and he was the picture of a shuffling monk. To behold the old freebooter, penniless, reduced by sickness, tall and gaunt, with a flowing white beard half a fathom long, marching barefoot at the head of a religious procession and carrying the tallest candle of them all, softened the hearts of his enemies, if he had any, in Manila. His accusers retracted their charges and were covered with confusion. He was released after 9 months and obtained passage to San Francisco on the ship, the Whittier, landing in April or May 1876. The US consul vouched for him as a destitute American seaman. US Customs records at San Francisco stated that on the 7th of October 1876, the American schooner Lotus, crew with 2 men with Hayes master, was cleared from San Francisco for Samoa. The San Francisco Evening Post of November 1876 says, "About 6 weeks ago, Bully Hayes left San Francisco in the schooner Lotus, well known to our yachting men, which he got from her owner, Captain Moody. He carried away with him $5,000 in cargo and money. Hayes, with all his faults, has friends who speak well of him. He has betrayed his trusts, he has stolen, and rumour says he has committed murder. His friends all confess that he cared as little about killing a man as he would about killing a fly. Those who wish to speak well of him tell many tales of his daring in saving life from shipwreck and his tenderness towards the survivors. He was suspected of killing his Adelaide wife and of arranging the drowning of his then wife, which occurred in New Zealand, but there is no proof that he did either, but he did save the lives of 17 people, Beck alleged." In the Hawaiian Gazette of December 1876, it says W.H. Hayes, this somewhat celebrated ocean rover, is reported to have last week been at Kauai, Sandwich Islands, in the yacht Lotus of San Francisco, bound for the Navigator Islands. In the Fiji Times on the 4th of April 1877, it says Bully Hayes was at Apia with the schooner and left on the 2nd of January 1877 for Providence and Strong's Island. An immense number of coconuts is said to be in store at these places, awaiting the arrival of Hayes, who assumes to be the proprietor of Providence Island, which is consequently unworked by traders. In March 1877, Hayes was killed by one of the crew of the Lotus during a voyage from Bonham Islands. The New York magazine Adventure had an account of Hayes's voyage from San Francisco up until his murder. The account was given by Charles Elson of Honolulu, who said he was a mate on the Lotus. Elson said he was in Manila on the bark Canada in 1876 and was one of those tried to get Hayes released. He met Hayes in San Francisco and said that in San Francisco, Hayes took a partner whose wife was very pretty. The couple were to go on the Lotus. A young Dutchman named Peter Raydeck, known as Dutch Pete, completed the crew. In October 1876, the Lotus was ready to sail and Hayes went ashore with his partner and the partner's wife. At midnight, Hayes and the woman came alongside the Lotus in a rowboat. The disappearance of the partner looked fishy to Elson, but Hayes passed over the matter lightly, and Elson says, "Hayes was not the man to stand cross-examination. I knew we would never see the missing man again, whatever his fate, and Hayes knew that I knew it. Hayes passed a lot of time in the woman's company, and later I had cause to think him very much smitten with her." Peter was surly. He signed on as a cook, but in addition to his duties in the galley, he was kept busy standing regular watch and working like an ordinary sailor would do. 2 or 3 days into their voyage, Hayes gave Peter an order, and Peter responded with, "It's nothing but work all the time. I'm the cook on this schooner, not the navigator." You could feel the captain's rage. He strode forward. Hayes, being much taller than Peter, glared down at the sailor and said between clenched teeth, "Oh, you are the cook on this schooner, are you? Well, I'm the master of this vessel. Do you know that?" "Yes, sir," responded the now frightened man. "You don't seem to know it, and I'm going to impress the fact on you so you won't forget it again this voyage." I didn't see how or where Hayes hit him, but I heard the cook fall. I saw him lying stunned with blood coming out of his mouth and nose. Peter was triced up and brutally flogged. The Lotus left Kauai, Hawaii, on the 1st of January 1877 and soon reached Samoa. Hayes persuaded Dr. Ingalls to sail with him in order to visit and treat one of the native kings in the Westward Islands. To gain his consent, the doctor was promised a fee of $2,000, half of which was to be paid shortly, but when they arrived at Bonham Island, otherwise known as Gillowit, the doctor was sent on shore with his traps under the threat that, should he make a noise over his treatment, he would succeed in getting his bones broken. But while the schooner lay in port, Peter deserted. He was soon secured through a reward and triced up and flogged soundly. At Apia, the people received Hayes like some prince coming home from a foreign land. The greetings the natives gave him caused me more astonishment. Despite the fact that he was noted amongst them as a harsh and often cruel man, they manifested invariably with the utmost delight over his appearance. We then stopped at a dozen islands and headed, finally, for the Bonham Island, then cleared for ascension late in January 1877. Leaving Cosray at Gillowit on the 31st of March 1877, it was learnt that shortly after sailing that Hayes had had another row with a Norwegian sailor and punished him severely and savagely. I went below about 10 o'clock tired out. For perhaps 2 hours I slept, and suddenly I woke sitting on my bunk. Some sort of sharp report had wakened me. I first thought it was thunder, then bang, bang. I knew it was a revolver being fired. "The captain has killed the Dutchman at last," I exclaimed, bounding out of the cabin. Before me were 2 forms, the big frame of Hayes and the figure of Peter. Both stood on the deck above the cockpit. High in the air, the sailor held a strange object that looked like a cross. Before I could stir or utter a cry, the cross fell upon the skull of the captain. Instantly, his clenched hands dropped to his sides, his head fell on his bosom, his knees sagged, and his massive body lurched backward into the water. "What have you done?" I yelled, with the Dutchman standing trembling in fright. "He tried to kill me," said the Dutchman. Peter managed to tell incoherently of the murder. When he failed to obey an order promptly, Hayes had started towards him, declaring he would kill the sailor and toss his body overboard. Peter, standing just forward of the cockpit, had prepared himself. As Hayes leapt for him, the sailor drew a revolver and fired in rapid succession. How many bullets struck Hayes or how many mortal wounds were inflicted, none could say. Some of the shots must have caused that mighty strength to rush out of Hayes's body, or else the trembling sailor would never have had time to snatch up the boom crutch and strike the blow that crushed the skull of the buccaneer and send its body to the grave in the Pacific. Australasia first heard of Hayes's murder from the Fiji Times on the 1st of September 1877. The great rover and freebooter of the South Pacific, Bully Hayes, has, we learn, come to an untimely end. By the return of the Black Hawk from Line Islands, we were informed that Captain Hayes, while trading in a small vessel off the island of Gillowit, had a series of bickerings and quarrels with his mate, and while in the act of going down, the companion to reach his revolver to shoot the mate was struck by him on the back of the head with an iron tiller, completely smashing his skull. So ends the life of this fearless pirate. The unlawful acts and deeds committed against property and society by this noted freebooter are very many, but we must question if they deserve that amount of sensationalism with which it has been the fashion to surround them. So Charles Elson and the remaining crew sailed the Lotus to Jellouet in the Marshall Islands and gave an account of the death of Bully Hayes. No one was concerned at his death. Indeed, Peter Radek was treated as a hero. In the San Francisco Post in June 1877, it says, Captain Hayes of the schooner yacht Lotus that sailed from this port on the 9th of October 1876 for the Samoan Islands was murdered in March by the cook, a Dutchman, who shipped in Samoa as a cook and seaman. The Lotus left Bonham Island, Jellouet, one of the Marshall Group, and 6 days afterwards she came back. Captain Hayes will be remembered as the gentleman whose strange life and adventures were published in November last under the caption, A San Francisco Pirate, Captain Bully Hayes, the Pirate of the South Seas. He had many friends who contend that his errors were those of the head and not the heart, and it is said of him, even by his enemies, that he was a man who never counted the cost when he could render assistance to fellow sailors in distress. He was only 50 years of age when he was slain. He might have attained an honourable career had he learnt self-discipline early in life, but he was indeed a strange mixture of a man. He was an astute entrepreneur, a mariner of great ability. He was courageous, resourceful, determined in the face of adversity, and capable of acts of generosity. However, he was also a philanderer and a rogue, given to towering rages and sullen moods. He regularly defrauded creditors and willingly engaged in illegal trading activities and had an enduring reputation for being ruthless. In keeping with the times, though, it is fair to say, though, that despite the descriptions that I've given in this episode, he probably was no worse than any other trader captains who sailed the Pacific during the 19th century. So a little on the legend of Bully Hayes. Well, Bully Hayes may never have taken a ship by force in the tradition of a pirate or a privateer, but his acts of fraud, having been his preferred means of gaining command of a ship, and the suspicion that he disposed of Ben Pease to gain command of the Pioneer, is true, then he may well have been a murderer. Much of his legend is due to the writing of Lewis Beck, who used his time with Hayes in the Pacific for stories such as Lewis Beck, A Memory of the Southern Seas, 1904, Captain Bully Hayes, Concerning Bully Hayes and the Wreck of the Leonora, A Memory of Bully Hayes. Louis Beck's collection of short stories titled Bully Hayes, Buccaneer and Other Stories was published in 1913 and had illustrations by Norman Lindsay. In some he tells stories of Hayes that are based on first-hand experience, but it is believed that there were quite a few fictional elements. Rolf Boldrewood, who I did an episode on in episode 58, wrote a book, A Modern Buccaneer, in 1894 that was based on Louis Beck's manuscript. In 1983, Hollywood star Tommy Lee Jones portrayed William Hayes in the movie Nathan Hayes, which was also titled Savage Islands. In 1986, the Federated States of Micronesia introduced a number of stamps that were based on scenes of Hayes's tumultuous life. It is believed the most reliable account of the life of Bully Hayes is Captain Bully Hayes, Blackbirder and Bigamist by Frank Clune, although he does include the disclaimer in the book that this book may be classed as fiction because it includes numerous yarns about the career of Bully Hayes that cannot be verified. Alfred Thomas Saunders, an accountant that lived in Australia, also wrote a book on Bully Hayes. In around 1911, Saunders took to visiting his bedridden aunt, who regaled him with stories of her time in the Spice Islands, where she'd met the famed naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace and the notorious Bully Hayes. The more he checked her dates and facts, the more that he trusted her memory, and he decided to commit the Hayes story to print. In the Sydney Morning Herald on the 20th of August 1932, of the stories of the Pacific of the earlier part of the last century, none has captured the romantically minded like that of Bully Hayes, an extraordinary character with an extraordinarily picturesque career. Much that has been written about him is fiction. Louis Beck said 9/10 of it was. Scraps of authentic information are obtainable, however, from a great many sources, including the records of the New South Wales Parliament. There are also files of the Herald and the Empire, and altogether enough to make Hayes a hero, even though he may have been a bad one. An interesting collection of the available matter is contained in a small book entitled Bully Hayes, Barrator, Bigamist, Buccaneer, Blackbirder and Pirate by Mr. A.T. Saunders, a second edition of which is to hand from the Sunday Times Publishing Company in Perth. Hayes became a captain by irregular methods that called for no examinations or certificates, but for audacity in sailing away in someone else's vessel or leaving the purchase money therefore unpaid. In the Herald Files of 1860 is an account of a police court case against him for obtaining money under false pretences. A British warship commander who reported about him said he was an unprincipled but shrewd man. One missionary is stated to have written that he was a perfect host and a thorough gentleman. Another said he was the greatest source of their annoyance in the 20 years that Hayes met his death fittingly. Hayes featured in an episode of the radio series Tales of the Southern Cross. Also, Hayes's character was featured in the film His Majesty's O'Keefe in 1954. In 1931, it mentioned in the Adelaide Mail that Basil Lubbock had a new book called Bully Hayes, South Sea Pirate. And in July 2006, Joan Druitt wrote a book, The Notorious Captain Hayes, The Remarkable True Story of William Bully Hayes, Pirate of the Pacific. In part 5 of this epic story on Bully Hayes, I'm going to be covering his children and some of his grandchildren. It does go for quite a long episode, but I just couldn't resist myself, as it is amazing how there are certain family members, descendants of Bully Hayes, where history has repeated itself in some respects.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.